The village of St. Anselm prided itself on being the sort of place where the most exciting event of any given week was the arrival of the Thursday post. Nestled in the gentle hills of the Cotswolds, with its honey-colored stone cottages and immaculately maintained village green, it was the kind of community that appeared in railway posters advertising the charms of rural England. On this particular Saturday in late June, however, St. Anselm was preparing to host an event that would prove far more memorable than anyone could have anticipated. Miss Jane Marple had arrived that morning from St. Mary Mead to spend a fortnight with her old friend, Mrs. Caroline Pemberton. "Do call me Carrie, Jane. I absolutely refuse to stand on ceremony at our age." Carrie had settled in St. Anselm 2 years previously, after inheriting Rosemount House from a distant cousin, and had thrown herself into village life with the enthusiasm of someone who had spent too many years in London drawing rooms. The occasion for Miss Marple's visit was the annual garden party for the Church Restoration Fund, to be held at Rosemount House. As Miss Marple observed from her bedroom window while unpacking her modest suitcase, the preparations had been elaborate. The lawn had been transformed with white marquees, bunting strung between the ancient oak trees, and tables laid with what appeared to be Carrie's best china. "I do hope you won't find it too tedious, Jane," Carrie had said over breakfast, her usually composed demeanor showing signs of strain, "but we simply must raise the funds for the church roof, and I'm afraid I've rather committed us to entertaining the entire village." Miss Marple had assured her friend that she found village gatherings quite fascinating, though she refrained from mentioning that her interest lay less in the charitable cause than in the opportunity to observe human nature in all its complexity. By 3 o'clock, the garden was pleasantly filled with the cream of St. Anselm society. The vicar, Reverend Hayworth, moved among the guests with practiced charm, while his wife, a nervous woman prone to dropping things, supervised the tea service with visible anxiety. Near the rose garden, Colonel Melchett held court with several retired military men, their conversation punctuated by frequent references to the war and young people today. The local doctor, a cheerful man named Dr. Bramwell, was engaged in animated discussion with the village's leading ladies about the merits of various tonics for summer ailments. Miss Marple had positioned herself in a wicker chair beneath the spreading branches of an ancient apple tree, her knitting in her lap, and her pale blue eyes taking in every detail of the social tableau before her. She had already noted several interesting dynamics. The way Mrs. Elspeth Gable, the village's self-appointed social arbiter, kept glancing nervously toward the house. The tension between young Clara Fairfax and her stepmother, Mrs. Vivian Fairfax, who controlled the girl's considerable inheritance, and the peculiar behavior of Mr. Roger Whitfield, a London solicitor who had arrived unexpectedly that morning. "Quite a turnout," observed Mrs. Dolly Bantry, settling into the chair beside Miss Marple with a satisfied sigh. Dolly was Carrie's closest friend in the village, a woman of comfortable proportions and comfortable opinions who served as an unofficial chronicler of local affairs. "Indeed," Miss Marple replied, her needles clicking softly, "though I notice there seems to be some sort of undercurrent, rather like the feeling one gets before a thunderstorm." Mrs. Bantry followed Miss Marple's gaze to where Mrs. Gable was speaking in urgent, hushed tones to Mr. Whitfield near the garden gate. "Oh, that business. Yes, there's been quite a to-do about old Mr. Fairfax's will. Died 6 months ago, you know, and left everything to that timid little Clara. But there's been some question about a codicil, something about it not being properly witnessed." Miss Marple's attention sharpened, though her expression remained serenely interested. "How very unfortunate for the young lady. I imagine such uncertainty must be quite distressing, particularly with that stepmother of hers making such a fuss," Mrs. Bantry continued, lowering her voice. "Vivian Fairfax has been telling anyone who'll listen that she should have inherited at least half the estate, being the widow and all. And then there's the matter of Clara's engagement to that musician fellow from London. Geoffrey something. Mrs. Gable has been quite vocal about unsuitable matches and fortune hunters. Before Miss Marple could respond, their conversation was interrupted by the approach of their hostess, who was carrying a silver tray bearing 3 exquisite teacups. The china was clearly her finest, delicate spode with a pattern of pink roses and gold trim that caught the afternoon sunlight. "Jane, dear, and Dolly," Carrie said, though her smile seemed somewhat forced, "I thought you might like to try some of my special Earl Grey. It's a blend I've sent specially from Fortnum's." She set the tray on the small table between their chairs with particular care. "I've only brought out the spode for today. These 3 cups are all that remain of the original set." Miss Marple examined the cups with genuine admiration. "How lovely, Carrie. They must be quite precious to you." "They belong to my great-aunt," Carrie replied, her voice taking on a wistful tone. "She always said they were lucky cups, that good fortune came to those who drank from them." She paused, glancing around the garden with an expression Miss Marple couldn't quite read. "I thought today might be an appropriate time to test that theory." As Carrie poured the tea, Miss Marple noticed several things that struck her as curious. First, the way her friend's hands trembled slightly as she handled the delicate china. Second, the fact that she had brought only 3 cups, when there were clearly more people in their immediate vicinity who might appreciate refreshment. And third, the way Mr. Whitfield kept glancing in their direction, his conversation with Mrs. Gable apparently concluded. "I say, Mrs. Pemberton," came a voice from behind them. They turned to see Mr. Whitfield approaching, his London-tailored suit and confident manner marking him as distinctly out of place among the country tweeds and summer frocks. "Might I have a word about that matter we discussed earlier?" Carrie's face went quite pale. "Oh, yes, of course, though perhaps after tea." "I'm afraid it rather can't wait," Whitfield interrupted, his tone polite but insistent. "The documentation needs to be reviewed before Monday, and I must return to London tomorrow evening." Miss Marple observed the exchange with growing interest. There was something in the man's manner, a barely concealed urgency beneath his professional courtesy, that reminded her unpleasantly of Mr. Jefferson Blake, who had once attempted to swindle the church building fund in St. Mary Mead. Mrs. Bantry, apparently sensing the tension, rose from her chair with diplomatic haste. "I believe I see Mrs. Hayworth struggling with the tombola prizes. Do excuse me." She bustled away, leaving Miss Marple alone with her hostess and the increasingly insistent Mr. Whitfield. "Perhaps," Carrie said with visible reluctance, "you could join us for tea. I'm sure whatever needs discussing can be managed civilly." Whitfield's eyes fell on the 3 cups, and something flickered across his face, an expression too quick for Miss Marple to fully interpret, though it reminded her of hunger. "How thoughtful. Yes, I believe that would be most appropriate." As he settled into Mrs. Bantry's vacated chair, Miss Marple noticed that Clara Fairfax had detached herself from a group of young people and was walking purposefully toward them, her face set in lines of determination that seemed at odds with her usually timid demeanor. "Mr. Whitfield," Clara called out as she approached, her voice carrying clearly across the lawn. "I've been looking for you. I believe we need to discuss the matter of the codicil." The effect of her words was immediate and dramatic. Mrs. Gable, who had been supervising the arrangement of cakes at a nearby table, dropped the plate she was holding. The crash of breaking china caused several heads to turn, but Miss Marple's attention remained fixed on the 3 people now gathered around the tea service. Whitfield had gone quite rigid, while Carrie was staring at Clara with an expression of what could only be described as terror. "My dear young lady," Whitfield said, his voice carefully controlled, "I hardly think this is the appropriate venue for legal discussions." "On the contrary," Clara replied, her chin lifting with surprising resolve. "I think it's the perfect venue. After all, it concerns everyone here, doesn't it?" She gestured toward the assembled guests, many of whom were now openly staring at their little group. Miss Marple set down her knitting and reached for one of the 3 cups, noting as she did so that Carrie's hand shot out as if to stop her, then fell back with visible effort. The tea was perfectly prepared, hot, fragrant, and exactly the right color. She took a small sip and found it excellent, though she couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong with this entire tableau. It was at that moment that the afternoon took its fatal turn. Mr. Whitfield, perhaps seeking to regain control of the situation, reached for his cup with an air of deliberate calm. "Very well, Miss Fairfax. If you insist on conducting business at a garden party, then let us at least be civilized about it." He raised the delicate china to his lips and took a substantial swallow. The change was almost instantaneous. His face contorted in surprise, then alarm, then something approaching panic. The cup slipped from his fingers, striking the table's edge before tumbling to the grass, where it landed with a soft thud that seemed unnaturally loud in the sudden silence. "I say," he gasped, one hand clutching at his throat. "Something's wrong. The tea—" His words dissolved into a horrible choking sound, and he half rose from his chair before collapsing back into it, his body convulsing violently. The scream that pierced the afternoon air came from Mrs. Gable, who had witnessed the entire scene from her position near the cake table. Within moments, Dr. Bramwell was pushing through the crowd of shocked onlookers, his medical bag somehow already in hand. But even as he knelt beside the stricken man, Miss Marple could see from his expression that it was too late. "He's gone," the doctor announced grimly, after what seemed an eternity but could only have been minutes. "Poison, I should think, from the symptoms. Something fast-acting, possibly cyanide." The garden, which moments before had been filled with the pleasant murmur of social conversation, was now silent except for Clara Fairfax's quiet sobbing and the distant sound of someone being violently sick behind the rose bushes. Miss Marple, still holding her own cup of tea, looked down at the remaining service on the tray. 3 cups there had been, one now lying broken on the grass beside a dead man, one in her own hands, and one still sitting untouched on the silver tray. She set her cup down very carefully and looked around at the faces of the assembled company. Carrie, pale as death and trembling. Clara, weeping but with what seemed almost like relief. Mrs. Gable, staring at the scene with undisguised horror. And all the others, shocked into temporary silence by the sudden intrusion of violent death into their peaceful afternoon. "Most curious," Miss Marple murmured to herself, though her voice carried clearly in the stillness. 3 cups prepared with such care, and yet only one proves fatal. One wonders whether it was the cup that was poisoned or the man who was meant to drink from it. As if her words had broken a spell, the garden erupted into chaos. Someone ran to telephone the police, while others began to back away from the tea service as if it might explode. But Miss Marple remained seated, her pale blue eyes moving thoughtfully from face to face, already beginning to notice the small telling details that others would overlook in their shock and confusion. In the distance, church bells began to toll the hour, their solemn notes seeming to mark not just the passage of time, but the end of St. Anselm's peaceful isolation from the darker aspects of human nature. The garden party was over, but Miss Marple's real work was just beginning. The news of Mr. Whitfield's death spread through St. Anselm with the peculiar velocity that accompanies truly shocking events in small communities. By the time Inspector Craddock arrived from the county headquarters, a methodical man in his early 40s with the sort of steady competence that inspired confidence, half the village had already formed theories about the crime, and the other half was busy spreading them. The garden at Rosemount House had been transformed from a scene of genteel social gathering into something far more sinister. Constables moved efficiently among the abandoned tea tables and overturned chairs, while Dr. Bramwell stood beside the covered body, speaking in low, urgent tones with the inspector. The 3 remaining teacups sat on their silver tray, like evidence in a courtroom, each one a potential key to murder. Miss Marple had been asked to remain in her wicker chair while the initial examination took place, and she observed with interest how differently people responded to the presence of violent death. Mrs. Gable had positioned herself near the constables, her sharp eyes taking in every detail with an expression that seemed more avid than horrified. Clara Fairfax had been led into the house by Mrs. Hayworth, though not before Miss Marple noticed the girl's peculiar mixture of distress and what appeared to be sigh relief. Most telling of all was Carrie Pemberton, who sat on the terrace steps with Mrs. Bantry's arm around her shoulders, trembling as if with fever. Inspector Craddock approached Miss Marple with the careful courtesy one might show an elderly relative at a funeral. "Miss Marple, I understand you witnessed the entire incident." "Indeed, Inspector, though I'm not certain how helpful my observations will prove." Miss Marple set aside her knitting with deliberate care. "Mr. Whitfield joined our little tea party quite unexpectedly and took the cup that had been intended for Mrs. Bantry." The inspector's pen paused over his notebook. "Intended for Mrs. Bantry? You're certain of this?" "Mrs. Pemberton had prepared 3 cups for herself, Mrs. Bantry, and myself. When Mrs. Bantry departed to assist with the tombola prizes, Mr. Whitfield took her chair and, naturally, her cup." Miss Marple's pale, blue eyes were thoughtful. One might say he was remarkably unfortunate in his choice of refreshment. Dr. Bramwell, who had finished his preliminary examination, joined them with grim news. "Cyanide, almost certainly." The bitter almond scent was unmistakable, and the rapidity of death confirms it. "A substantial dose, I should think." Inspector Craddock made careful notes before looking up sharply. "And you drank from one of the other cups, Miss Marple?" "A small sip, yes. I experienced no ill effects whatsoever." Miss Marple indicated the remaining cup on the tray. "Which suggests the poison was placed in that specific cup rather than in the teapot itself." The inspector's expression grew more serious as the implications became clear. This was not a random poisoning, but a carefully targeted murder, though whether the target had been Whitfield or Mrs. Bantry remained to be determined. From the direction of the village came Constable Harris, slightly out of breath from his hurried return. "Inspector," he called, holding up a small glass vial with evident satisfaction, "found this in the shrubbery near the garden gate. Empty, but there's residue inside that might tell us something." The discovery of the vial sent a visible shiver through the remaining guests. Mrs. Gable immediately declared it proved her theory about outside influences, while Colonel Melchett muttered darkly about London types and their mysterious ways. But Miss Marple noticed that Carrie Pemberton had stopped trembling and was staring at the vial with an expression of complete bewilderment. Inspector Craddock surveyed the assembled company with the measured gaze of a man accustomed to reading guilt in human faces. "I'm afraid I must ask everyone to remain available for questioning. No one is to leave St. Anselm without my express permission." The announcement produced the expected chorus of protests, but Miss Marple was more interested in who remained silent. Clara Fairfax had reappeared from the house and was standing very still by the French windows, her face pale as porcelain. When the inspector mentioned the vial, she glanced quickly toward the garden gate, then just as quickly away. "Most curious," Miss Marple murmured to herself, though her voice carried clearly in the afternoon air. 3 cups prepared with such particular care, and yet only one proves fatal. One cannot help but wonder whether the poison found its intended victim, or whether we are dealing with a murderer who must now be rather disappointed with the afternoon's work. As the inspector began organizing his formal interviews, Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her mind already working through the puzzle of personalities and motives that lay beneath St. Anselm's peaceful surface. The garden party was over, but the real investigation was just beginning, and she suspected the truth would prove far more complex than anyone yet imagined. By Sunday morning, St. Anselm had transformed into a village consumed by speculation and whispered theories. The usual post-service gathering outside the church had taken on an urgent, conspiratorial quality, with small clusters of parishioners huddled together like plotters in a medieval drama. Miss Marple, walking slowly beside a subdued Carrie Pemberton, observed the social dynamics with her characteristic blend of mild interest and sharp attention. Mrs. Gable had positioned herself strategically near the church gate, where she could intercept the maximum number of departing congregants. Her voice carried clearly across the churchyard as she expounded her latest theory to anyone within earshot. "Mark my words, it was meant for poor Dolly Bantry. That London solicitor simply had the misfortune to drink from the wrong cup. Someone in this village has been harboring a grudge, and yesterday it finally boiled over." The theory found ready acceptance among several listeners, though Miss Marple noticed that Mrs. Bantry herself appeared more shaken than flattered by the suggestion that she had been the intended victim. There was something in her friend's manner, a nervous glancing about, a tendency to start at sudden sounds, that suggested genuine fear rather than mere social excitement. Inspector Craddock had established his temporary headquarters in the drawing-room at Rosemount House, and by afternoon had conducted a series of interviews that revealed far more complexity than the village gossips had imagined. Miss Marple, having been invited to remain in the morning room while Carrie rested upstairs, found herself ideally positioned to observe the comings and goings of witnesses. Clara Fairfax emerged from her interview in a state of visible agitation, her usual timid demeanor replaced by something approaching defiance. When she encountered Miss Marple in the hallway, the words seemed to tumble out of her almost involuntarily. "They keep asking about the codicil, as if I should be grateful that Mr. Whitfield is dead. But don't you see? Now no one will ever know what my father truly intended." The girl's distress appeared genuine, but Miss Marple had learned long ago that genuine emotion could coexist with guilty knowledge. "The codicil was found, then?" she inquired gently. Clara's laugh was bitter. "Oh yes, it was found. In Mr. Whitfield's briefcase, exactly as he said it would be, and it changes everything, or would have, if he had lived to authenticate it." Her hands clenched into fists. "It reduces my inheritance by more than half, giving most of it to Vivian provided I marry someone she approves of. My father never would have agreed to such a thing. Never." When Inspector Craddock joined Miss Marple later for tea, his expression was that of a man wrestling with an increasingly complicated puzzle. "The laboratory confirms cyanide in the cup, and we've found traces in a small vial discovered in the shrubbery. But the more we learn about motives, the more confused the picture becomes." He consulted his notebook with evident frustration. "Mrs. Fairfax stands to gain significantly if the codicil had been validated, but with Whitfield dead, it cannot be. Clara inherits everything under the original will. But she seemed genuinely distressed about Whitfield's death preventing the codicil's authentication. Mrs. Bantry had a minor dispute with Whitfield over a right-of-way, hardly grounds for murder, and Mrs. Pemberton appears to have no motive whatsoever." Miss Marple set down her teacup with deliberate care. "Inspector, I keep returning to the matter of those 3 cups. Mrs. Pemberton was most particular about them. They were her lucky cups, she said, meant to bring good fortune to those who drank from them, but she was also very specific about which cup went to whom. You think the selection wasn't random?" "I think, Inspector, that someone who knew Mrs. Pemberton's habits very well would understand exactly how she would distribute those cups. The slightly chipped one for Mrs. Bantry, whom she likes but doesn't fuss over. The one with the darker rose pattern for herself, because it was her favorite. And the perfect, flawless cup." Miss Marple paused meaningfully. "For her most honored guest," Craddock finished. "Which would have been you, Miss Marple." "Precisely. But Mr. Whitfield arrived unexpectedly and took Mrs. Bantry's seat, and therefore her cup. The question remains, was the poison meant for Mrs. Bantry, for me, or for whoever might claim the place of honor at that little tea party?" As evening shadows lengthened across the garden where a man had died less than 24 hours earlier, Miss Marple sat quietly with her knitting, pondering the curious mathematics of murder. 3 cups, each with its intended recipient, and one terrible mistake that had claimed the wrong life entirely. The truth, she suspected, lay not in who had died, but in who had been meant to die, and why. Monday morning brought Inspector Craddock to Rosemount House with a discovery that cast the entire investigation in a different light. Among Mr. Whitfield's personal effects, he had found a small leather notebook containing appointments and reminders. The entry for Saturday afternoon was brief but revealing. 3 p.m., garden party, CP, the matter we discussed. The implication was clear. Whitfield's presence at the garden party had not been the social coincidence everyone assumed. When confronted with this evidence, Carrie Pemberton's carefully maintained composure finally cracked, revealing a woman under considerable strain. "I should have mentioned it," she confessed to Miss Marple as they sat in the morning room, away from the inspector's official questioning. "Roger did write to me last week requesting a private word during the garden party. But Jane, I was so hoping he wouldn't come. The man had a talent for remembering things that others preferred forgotten." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused in their rhythm. "What sort of things, my dear?" Carrie's hands trembled as she reached for her teacup. "Years ago, before I inherited this house, there was a small financial irregularity involving some investments my late husband had made. Nothing criminal, you understand, but the sort of thing that could be made to look quite damaging in the wrong hands. Roger helped resolve it quietly, but he never let me forget that he held that knowledge." This revelation transformed the victim from an unfortunate bystander into something far more complex. Inspector Craddock, armed with this new perspective, began uncovering a web of connections that reached throughout the village. Colonel Melchett had once required Whitfield's services regarding a questionable land transaction in India. Dr. Bramwell had consulted him about a medical negligence claim that had been settled privately. Even Mrs. Gable, it emerged, had sought his advice about a boundary dispute that could have exposed certain irregularities in her property deeds. The investigation took on new urgency as Inspector Craddock methodically reconstructed the timeline of Saturday afternoon. Carrie's account of preparing the tea became crucial evidence. She had taken the 3 precious Spode cups from the morning room cabinet, rinsed them in the scullery to remove dust, then carried them to the kitchen where Cook was preparing refreshments with the help of young Elsie. "I placed the cups on the dresser while I fetched the special tea caddy from the locked pantry," Carrie explained, her voice barely above a whisper. "It couldn't have been more than a minute, but in that minute, someone could have—" The inspector nodded grimly. The kitchen had been bustling with activity, servants coming and going, and anyone familiar with the house could have slipped in unnoticed. The window overlooked the garden, providing a clear view of the guests and the perfect opportunity to see when Carrie was approaching with the tray. It was while examining the route from kitchen to garden that Miss Marple made her own discovery. Caught in the thorns of a climbing rose near the garden gate was a small fragment of dark fabric, barely visible among the leaves. More significantly, pressed into the soft earth beneath was a distinctive button, silver, ornately carved, and clearly from an expensive gentleman's waistcoat. When she presented these items to Inspector Craddock, his expression grew thoughtful. The fabric could belong to anyone, but this button— he examined it carefully. "It matches those on Whitfield's waistcoat, though I don't recall noticing one missing from his clothing." Miss Marple considered this carefully. "Perhaps it was pulled loose during an argument, Inspector. Someone who met him here, away from the other guests, for a final, desperate conversation. The physical evidence suggested that Whitfield's death had not been a coldly calculated murder planned in advance, but rather the culmination of a confrontation that had escalated beyond control. Someone had argued with him near the garden gate, perhaps pleaded with him or threatened him, and when words failed, had resorted to the poison that was already prepared and waiting. As evening approached, Miss Marple sat quietly in the drawing-room, her knitting providing a meditative rhythm for her thoughts. The case was becoming clearer in some ways, more complex in others. Whitfield had not been an innocent victim, but a man who traded in other people's secrets. Yet the method of his death, the careful preparation, the specific targeting of one cup among three, suggested someone with intimate knowledge of household routines and social customs. The murderer was someone who knew Carrie well enough to predict her behavior, someone who understood that she would use her precious cups for honored guests, and someone desperate enough to risk everything on a single, perfectly timed act of violence. Most importantly, it was someone who remained among them, watching and waiting, perhaps wondering whether a lost button and a scrap of fabric would be enough to unravel their carefully constructed deception. Tuesday morning brought Geoffrey Marsden to St. Anselm, arriving on the early train from London in a state of considerable agitation. Clara's fiancé was a tall, sensitive-looking young man, with the sort of artistic features that immediately marked him as an outsider in the conservative village. His presence created an immediate stir, not least because he had failed to mention to the police that he had been in the vicinity during the garden party. Miss Marple observed his reunion with Clara from the morning-room window, noting the girl's obvious relief at seeing him, followed quickly by what appeared to be an urgent, whispered conversation. There was something in their manner, a furtive quality that suggested secrets shared and burdens divided, that reminded her unpleasantly of young couples she had known who found themselves in desperate circumstances. Inspector Craddock's investigation had meanwhile uncovered a disturbing letter among Whitfield's papers. Written 3 weeks earlier by Mrs. Vivian Fairfax, it offered the solicitor a substantial sum to authenticate the codicil, regardless of any technical irregularities he might discover. The tone was desperate, almost pleading, and revealed a woman far more financially strained than her elegant appearance suggested. When confronted with this evidence, Vivian received the news with icy composure, though Miss Marple noticed the tremor in her carefully manicured hands. "My late husband's estate should have been divided equitably," she declared with the bearing of a duchess addressing servants. That codicil represented his true wishes, not the ramblings of a sick man influenced by a manipulative child. The inspector's examination of the crime scene had also yielded new evidence. The silver button found near the garden gate proved to match those on Whitfield's waistcoat, but crucially, it was not from the garment he had been wearing. Someone else possessed an identical waistcoat or had deliberately planted the button to create confusion. Geoffrey's confession to his secret presence added another layer of complexity. He had been watching from the lane, he admitted to Miss Marple, wanting to observe this Whitfield fellow who was causing such difficulties for Clara's inheritance. "I saw him arrive, saw him join your tea party, and then," he swallowed hard, "I saw him die. I panicked and left before anyone could notice me." But it was Mrs. Bantry who provided the most crucial piece of information during an afternoon visit. She had remembered something troubling about the moments before Whitfield's death. "You know, Jane, I've been thinking about how he reached for that cup. He didn't just take the nearest one, he specifically chose the cup that had been meant for me, almost as if someone had told him which one to take." Miss Marple's needles paused mid-stitch. "Are you certain, Dolly?" "Quite certain. Just before I left to help Mrs. Hayworth, I heard Carrie mention to him that the cup on the left was Earl Grey, her special blend. He reached for it deliberately, saying something about preferring Earl Grey to any other variety. This revelation transformed everything. If Whitfield had been directed to a specific cup, then the murderer had known exactly which one he would choose. The precision required suggested not random opportunity, but careful orchestration. Someone who understood both the social dynamics of the tea service and Carrie's habits well enough to predict her behavior. The investigation's focus shifted to the narrow window of time between the cups being prepared in the kitchen and the tray being carried to the garden. Someone with access to the house, knowledge of the routine and nerves of steel, had seized that moment to add poison to a single cup, trusting that social convention would ensure the right person received it. As evening shadows lengthened across the garden where a man had died, Miss Marple sat quietly, contemplating the accumulating evidence. The case was beginning to resemble what she had once described to Inspector Craddock as amateur theatricals, a carefully staged performance where everyone had been assigned a role, but where someone had missed their cue entirely. The murderer had directed their scene with meticulous attention to detail, only to watch helplessly as the wrong actor delivered the fatal lines. The question that remained was whether Whitfield's death had been the intended outcome, or whether they were dealing with a killer whose carefully laid plans had gone catastrophically wrong, claiming an unintended victim while leaving the real target still very much alive. By Wednesday, the atmosphere in St. Anselm had shifted from shocked disbelief to a brittle watchfulness that made ordinary conversations feel fraught with hidden meaning. People still conducted their daily business, but conversations halted abruptly when strangers approached, and curtains twitched with unusual frequency. The vicar's wife reported that morning service attendance had increased dramatically, though whether from piety or nervous insurance against unpleasant surprises remained unclear. Inspector Craddock had spent the morning re-interviewing the servants at Rosemount House, focusing particularly on the crucial minutes in the kitchen. While their stories remained broadly consistent, small discrepancies had begun to emerge, the sort Miss Marple always found most revealing. Elsie admitted she had left the kitchen entirely for several minutes to chase away a delivery boy who had been tormenting the cat. Cook remembered the footman, Harry, lingering by the dresser, though she couldn't specify what he had been doing. Harry himself insisted he had merely straightened the cups to prevent them from sliding. Most significantly, young Elsie approached Miss Marple privately that afternoon, her conscience clearly troubling her. "I didn't think it mattered at first, miss," she confessed, twisting her apron nervously, "but I did see someone come into the kitchen just after Mrs. Pemberton set down the cups. Mrs. Gable, it was, saying she needed to speak with Cook about the cake arrangements. But she never did speak to Cook, just stood very close to the dresser where the cups were sitting, adjusting her gloves in that particular way ladies do, then left very quickly." This revelation cast Mrs. Gable's subsequent behavior in an entirely new light. The woman who had been so vocal in her theories about the murder, so eager to direct suspicion toward others, suddenly emerged as someone with both opportunity and means. But Miss Marple found herself wondering about motive until an unexpected source provided the answer. Colonel Melchett, whose military bearing had begun to crack under the strain of investigation, sought out Miss Marple in the garden where she was taking her afternoon constitutional. His confession tumbled out with the relief of a man unburdening himself of a heavy secret. "The thing is, Miss Marple, Elspeth Gable and I were engaged once, years ago before the war. She broke it off when she discovered certain financial irregularities in my regiment's accounts. Nothing criminal, but the sort of thing that could have ruined my career." He paused, his weathered face troubled. Mrs. Bantry knew about it. She was Elspeth's closest friend back then, and Elspeth confided everything to her. When I settled in St. Anselm last year, I begged Dolly to keep the old scandal quiet. She agreed, but Elspeth has never forgotten, never forgiven either of us for what she sees as a betrayal of her. Trust. The pieces were beginning to arrange themselves into a coherent pattern, though Miss Marple sensed something crucial was still missing. Mrs. Gable had motive to harm Mrs. Bantry and opportunity to poison the cup intended for her, but the scenario required a level of cold-blooded calculation that seemed at odds with the woman's emotional, almost theatrical personality. Dr. Bramwell's afternoon visit to check on Carrie's nerves provided another crucial detail. During his examination of the crime scene, he had noticed something about the poison's preparation. "The compound used wasn't simply cyanide," he confided to Miss Marple. "It was derived from cherry laurel leaves, a preparation requiring both botanical knowledge and access to a well-stocked garden." Moreover, the bitter almond scent was cleverly masked by the strong bergamot flavoring of the Earl Grey tea. Miss Marple's needles paused in their rhythm. Someone had known exactly which tea blend Carrie would serve and had counted on its distinctive aroma to conceal the poison's presence. This suggested intimate knowledge not just of household routines, but of Carrie's particular preferences and habits. The evening brought Inspector Craddock to discuss his findings, his expression that of a man wrestling with an increasingly complex puzzle. The laboratory has traced the poison vial to a London chemist purchased 3 months ago under the name C. Fairfax. The signature bears a striking resemblance to Clara's handwriting, though she vehemently denies any knowledge of the purchase. As darkness fell over the village, Miss Marple sat quietly reviewing everything she had learned. The case was beginning to resemble what she had once described as amateur theatricals, a carefully staged performance where everyone had been assigned roles, but where someone had missed their cue entirely. The murderer had orchestrated events with meticulous attention to detail, only to watch helplessly as the wrong actor delivered the fatal lines. The question that haunted her was whether they were dealing with a killer whose carefully laid plans had gone catastrophically wrong, or someone clever enough to make their success look like failure, using Whitfield's death to eliminate suspicion from themselves while directing it toward others. Thursday brought a revelation that transformed the entire complexion of the case, arriving not through dramatic confrontation, but through the sort of quiet domestic conversation that Miss Marple had always found most illuminating. She was helping Carrie reorganize her linen cupboard, a task that seemed to provide her friend with some measure of comfort amid the chaos, when the truth about the teacups finally emerged. "You know, Jane," Carrie said, her hands trembling slightly as she folded a lavender-scented sheet, "I haven't been entirely truthful about those cups. They weren't simply my great-aunt's treasures. They were part of a wedding set, given to her by a suitor she ultimately rejected, a man whose family was later ruined by scandal." Miss Marple paused in her sorting, sensing the importance of what was coming. "And who was this unfortunate suitor, my dear?" "His name was Arthur Whitfield," Carrie replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Roger's father. When Roger wrote requesting our meeting, he mentioned the cups specifically. He said he wanted to see the family legacy that should rightfully have been his inheritance." This connection between victim and murder weapon cast everything in an entirely different light. The cups were not merely convenient vessels for poison. They were symbolic objects charged with historical grievance and family resentment that had festered across generations. Inspector Craddock received this information with grim satisfaction when Miss Marple shared it that afternoon. So Whitfield had a personal interest in the cups. Perhaps he even insisted on using a specific one. That would explain his deliberate choice of Mrs. Bantry's cup. But Miss Marple shook her head thoughtfully. "I think not, Inspector. The cups were nearly identical except for the most minor variations in pattern. Only someone intimately familiar with the set, someone who had studied it, perhaps obsessed over it for years, would be able to distinguish one from another with certainty." The afternoon brought additional revelations that suggested a more complex web of deception. Geoffrey Marsden, looking haggard and desperate, approached Miss Marple privately with information that shattered one of the investigation's key assumptions. "Clara couldn't have purchased that poison," he insisted, producing a pair of concert ticket stubs from his wallet. "We were together in London on the date shown in the chemist's register. I have the receipts, the program, everything." This alibi, if verified, would exonerate Clara entirely. But it raised an even more disturbing question. Who would go to such elaborate lengths to frame an innocent young woman? The forged signature, the false identity, it suggested a malice that extended far beyond the immediate crime. Mrs. Bantry's discovery that same afternoon provided another piece of the puzzle. Hidden in her garden shed, tucked behind the pruning shears where it might have remained undiscovered indefinitely, was a small bottle containing traces of the same cherry laurel preparation that had killed Whitfield. The bottle bore partial fingerprints that matched those found on the vial near the garden gate. "But Jane," Mrs. Bantry said, her voice shaking with indignation and fear, "I haven't been in that shed since before the garden party. Someone must have placed it there deliberately. But who would have access? And why implicate me?" The pattern of evidence was becoming clearer, revealing not a simple murder motivated by greed or passion, but an elaborate scheme designed to settle old scores while deflecting suspicion onto carefully chosen scapegoats. Someone with intimate knowledge of village relationships and family histories had orchestrated events with meticulous precision. Dr. Bramwell's analysis of the poison preparation provided the final crucial detail. The cherry laurel water showed signs of having been prepared weeks in advance, not hastily mixed in a moment of desperation. Moreover, the concentration was far higher than necessary for a single dose, suggesting the murderer had prepared enough for multiple attempts, or multiple victims. As evening shadows lengthened across the village, Miss Marple sat quietly with her knitting, contemplating the accumulating evidence. The murderer had left a carefully constructed trail that pointed simultaneously toward Clara, Mrs. Bantry, and Mrs. Gable, creating a maze of suspicion where every path seemed to lead both toward and away from guilt. But there was something else, something that nagged at the edges of her consciousness like a half-remembered melody. The silver button found in the garden hadn't come from Whitfield's waistcoat, and it hadn't been planted randomly to confuse the investigation. It belonged to someone whose connection to the Whitfield family was closer than anyone had yet suspected. Someone who had waited years for the perfect opportunity to claim what they believed was rightfully theirs, using the very cups that symbolized their family's ancient grievance as the instruments of their revenge. The truth was finally within reach, requiring only one more careful test to expose the killer who had hidden so skillfully among the innocent. Friday morning brought Inspector Craddock to Rosemount House with evidence that would transform the entire investigation, though the revelation came not through dramatic confrontation, but through the sort of meticulous domestic detail that Miss Marple had always found most illuminating. Hidden among the household accounts, a simple entry for livery repair and button replacement had led to a discovery that cast the silver button found near the garden gate in an entirely new light. The button had not come from Whitfield's waistcoat at all, but from a servant's livery that had been donated to the church jumble sale 3 months earlier, a sale organized by Mrs. Elspeth Gable. When confronted with this evidence, along with the discovery of matching buttons in her possession, Mrs. Gable's carefully maintained composure finally cracked, revealing a woman burdened by secrets far more complex than village gossip. "My maiden name was Whitfield," she confessed to Miss Marple in the morning room, her voice barely above a whisper. "Roger was my cousin, distant, but family nonetheless. Those cups should have been ours, part of our inheritance, but my great-aunt chose the Pembertons over us when scandal touched our name." The family connection explained the intensity of Mrs. Gable's interest in the case, but Miss Marple sensed something deeper still lay hidden. The elaborate staging of evidence, the careful misdirection toward multiple suspects, it suggested a mind far more calculating than Mrs. Gable's emotional, theatrical nature would allow. That afternoon, Miss Marple proposed to Inspector Craddock a psychological experiment that would require delicate orchestration. "We must create a situation where the true murderer believes their deception has succeeded entirely, yet simultaneously feels threatened by an unexpected danger." The key players were assembled once more in the drawing room at Rosemount House, each believing they had been summoned for routine questioning. Mrs. Gable sat rigidly upright, her newfound honesty about her family connection lending her an air of tragic dignity. Carrie remained pale and trembling near the fireplace, while Clara and Geoffrey stood together by the window, their clasped hands betraying their continued anxiety. Miss Marple had arranged the 3 remaining spode cups on the central table, each filled with tea from the same pot. The symbolic weight of this arrangement was lost on no one present. Mrs. Gable has been most forthcoming about her family connection to Mr. Whitfield, Inspector Craddock began formally, and about her presence in the kitchen at the crucial moment. However, her account raises as many questions as it answers. Mrs. Gable's voice carried a new steadiness as she addressed the room. I went to the kitchen intending something. I hardly knew what. Perhaps to touch the cups, to claim some small connection to what should have been mine. But when I saw them sitting there, so perfect and untouchable, I couldn't bring myself to do anything harmful. I adjusted my gloves and left, carrying my resentment with me as I had for decades. Miss Marple had been watching the assembled company with her characteristic blend of mild interest and sharp attention. During Mrs. Gable's confession, she observed something crucial, a flicker of relief crossing someone's face, quickly suppressed but unmistakable. It was the reaction of someone who had counted on Mrs. Gable's obvious guilt to shield their own. "How curious," Miss Marple murmured, her needles clicking softly as she resumed her knitting. "Mrs. Gable speaks of adjusting her gloves, such a particular gesture. It reminds me of someone else I observed that afternoon, someone who also made very deliberate adjustments to their appearance at precisely the moment when the poison could have been administered." The atmosphere in the room grew electric with tension. Miss Marple continued in her deceptively mild tone. "You see, I've been wondering about the true purpose of Mr. Whitfield's visit. He mentioned wanting to discuss the matter we discussed, but what if that matter wasn't blackmail or legal documents? What if he had discovered something far more immediate and dangerous, something about the codicil that would have exposed not just forgery, but murder?" She looked directly at Clara, whose face had gone ashen. "The signature on that poison purchase wasn't forged by someone trying to frame you, my dear. It was forged by someone who knew your handwriting intimately. Someone who had been practicing it for months, preparing for exactly this moment." Geoffrey's protective hand on Clara's shoulder tightened involuntarily, and Miss Marple saw what she had been waiting for, the subtle tell that revealed not innocence, protecting innocence, but guilt attempting to control the narrative one final time. "The murderer made one crucial error," Miss Marple concluded softly. "They assumed that killing Mr. Whitfield would silence him permanently, but dead men, as I've often observed, sometimes speak louder than the living." The silence that followed Miss Marple's gentle pronouncement stretched taut as a wire, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of the mantel clock. Geoffrey Marsden's face had undergone a subtle transformation, the sensitive artistic features hardening into something far more calculating as he weighed his rapidly diminishing options. "You're suggesting I murdered Whitfield?" His voice carried precisely the right note of outraged innocence, though his protective hand on Clara's shoulder seemed to tighten rather than comfort. "That's preposterous. I've provided alibis, witnesses. I wasn't even officially present at the garden party." Miss Marple resumed her knitting with deliberate calm. "No, Mr. Marsden, you weren't officially present, but you were watching from the lane, as you yourself admitted. More significantly, your frequent visits during your courtship had made you intimately familiar with this household's routines, particularly Mrs. Pemberton's fondness for serving honored guests from her precious Spode cups." Inspector Craddock had positioned himself strategically near the door. The concert alibi was cleverly constructed. Genuine tickets, authentic receipts, all carefully preserved. However, the chemist's register shows the poison purchase occurred at 3:30 that afternoon. Your concert didn't begin until 8 o'clock. Geoffrey's composure began showing hairline fractures, like porcelain under stress. Clara had pulled slightly away from him, her expression shifting from confusion to dawning horror as implications crystallized in her mind. "The codicil was entirely genuine," Miss Marple continued conversationally. "Mr. Whitfield had authenticated it completely. But here lies the tragic irony. He wasn't coming to present it to probate court. 3 weeks ago, he discovered evidence that you had forged an additional clause, one that would have given Mrs. Fairfax veto power over Clara's marriage choices, while reducing the inheritance substantially. The financial motive was becoming clear, But Miss Marple sensed deeper desperation driving Geoffrey's actions. "Your musical career wasn't merely struggling, was it, Mr. Marsden? Those letters from agents, the recording contracts you showed Clara, all forgeries. You had debts in London that would have meant prison within weeks. Clara's inheritance represented not comfort, but survival itself." Dr. Bramwell, who had been listening intently, spoke with clinical precision. "The cherry laurel preparation requires both botanical knowledge and access to mature plants. The Fairfax estate has extensive laurel hedging, doesn't it? Which Mr. Marsden harvested during his courtship visits," Inspector Craddock added grimly. "The concentration needed requires weeks of preparation, time he had while gaining everyone's trust and studying household routines." Geoffrey's mask was slipping completely now, revealing the calculating predator beneath the romantic facade. "This is elaborate fiction based on elderly speculation and circumstantial evidence. I loved Clara. I would never harm anyone to secure her inheritance." "But you didn't intend to harm just anyone," Miss Marple corrected gently. "Your target was Mrs. Bantry, whose death would have been attributed to Mrs. Gable's well-known resentments. The codicil would have remained unvalidated. Clara would have inherited everything, and you could have married her with no one questioning your background too closely." She paused, allowing the accusation's weight to settle. "Mr. Whitfield's death was actually a catastrophic accident from your perspective. He took the wrong cup entirely, died in completely the wrong circumstances, and triggered exactly the sort of intensive investigation you'd hoped to avoid." From near the door came a strangled sob. Young Elsie, the kitchen maid, had been standing unnoticed throughout the confrontation. Now she collapsed onto a nearby chair, tears streaming down her face. "I didn't know anyone would die. He told me it would just make her sick, just enough to postpone the meeting." The revelation hit like a thunderbolt. Geoffrey had seduced the impressionable young woman, using her infatuation to gain inside information and eventually to plant the poison in the carefully selected cup. "The truly diabolical aspect," Miss Marple observed sadly, "was the systematic misdirection, the silver button from donated livery, the planted evidence in Mrs. Bantry's shed, the forged poison purchase in Clara's name, all designed to create a maze of equally plausible suspects." As Inspector Craddock's men moved to restrain Geoffrey, who had made a desperate lunge toward the French windows, the elegant mask finally shattered completely. The struggling, cursing man being dragged away bore no resemblance to the charming musician who had won Clara's heart. Miss Marple watched the proceedings with profound sadness. "The greatest tragedy," she murmured to Carrie as poor Elsie was, led away in tears, "is that Mr. Whitfield was coming to protect Clara's inheritance, not threaten it. He died trying to expose the very forgery that would have secured Mr. Marsden's position." The bitter irony was complete. Geoffrey had murdered the one man who could have validated his worst fears about the codicil, destroying himself through his own impatience and greed. The week following Geoffrey Marsden's arrest settled over St. Anselm like the quiet after a violent thunderstorm, the air cleaner but charged with the memory of what had passed. The village resumed its familiar rhythms with deliberate normalcy. The conversations at the post office carried hushed undertones, and the church bells seemed to toll with particular solemnity. The legal resolution Inspector Craddock's final report painted a picture of calculated deception that shocked even seasoned investigators. Geoffrey's confession, extracted after confrontation with overwhelming evidence, revealed the full scope of his manipulation. The cherry laurel poison had been prepared weeks in advance, harvested during his courtship visits to the Fairfax estate, where extensive hedging provided abundant material. His debts to London moneylenders were far worse than anyone had imagined. Bankruptcy and criminal charges had been imminent within days. The forged signature on the poison purchase had been practiced for months. Geoffrey studying Clara's handwriting from love letters she had innocently shared. The concert alibi was genuine for the evening performance, but the chemist's afternoon hours had provided the crucial window for his deadly acquisition. Young Elsie's manipulation had been particularly cruel, her infatuation systematically cultivated until she became an unwitting accomplice, genuinely believing the powder would cause only temporary illness. The silver button was his masterpiece of misdirection, Miss Marple explained to Inspector Craddock during their final interview. By planting evidence for Mrs. Gable's jumble sale donation, he created a trail leading to someone with obvious motive and opportunity. He recognized her resentments and exploited them brilliantly, never knowing about her family connection to Whitfield. The aftermath for each soul. Clara Fairfax bore the revelation of Geoffrey's betrayal with remarkable dignity that surprised even those who knew her well. The discovery that her romance had been built entirely on calculation and greed was devastating, but it had also freed her from a cage she hadn't known she occupied. Without Geoffrey's subtle manipulation, she began to emerge from her shell like a butterfly discovering its wings. Miss Marple observed her walking through the village with her head held high, no longer the timid creature who had hidden in shadows. "You see, Miss Marple," Clara confided during a quiet afternoon walk, "I always told myself Geoffrey needed me. It never occurred to me to ask whether he deserved me." There was no bitterness in her tone, only a dawning self-awareness that Miss Marple found genuinely hopeful. Young Elsie's fate proved more complex. Her role as an unwitting accomplice, combined with Miss Marple's quiet intervention and Inspector Craddock's measured testimony about her manipulation, resulted in a lenient sentence at a reformatory rather than prison. Foolishness and wickedness are not quite the same thing, Miss Marple observed when the verdict was announced. The law sometimes forgets that distinction. It is our good fortune when those who administer it do not. Mrs. Gable underwent perhaps the most profound transformation. The exposure of her Whitfield connection and her ancient grievances had stripped away much of her self-righteousness, leaving a woman more vulnerable than venomous. After weeks of avoiding Carrie, she finally appeared at Rosemount House with stiff humility and a covered dish of her famous sponge cake. "I suppose I have allowed old wrongs to grow rather too large in my imagination," she admitted awkwardly. Carrie, who had suffered her own sleepless nights, responded with unexpected gentleness. "Old wrongs tend to do that, Elspeth. Perhaps we might agree to water them a little less in future." The two women shared tea without barbed remarks, which in village terms amounted to reconciliation. Mrs. Bantry found herself simultaneously shaken and energized by having been an intended victim. Her gratitude toward Miss Marple manifested in a luxurious wool order sent anonymously from London, which Miss Marple pretended not to understand, though the soft new yarn appeared suspiciously quickly upon her needles. The village heals. As the days passed, St. Anselm slowly knitted itself back together, the way English villages always do after trauma. The Church Restoration Fund had received an unexpected boost from anonymous donors, perhaps guilt money, perhaps simple relief that the worst was over. Mrs. Hayworth stopped dropping things quite so frequently, and Colonel Melchett's war stories resumed their familiar cadence at the pub. The 3 remaining Spode cups were quietly retired to the back of Carrie's cabinet. "I don't believe I shall ever be able to use them again," she confided to Miss Marple. "Objects, like people, carry memories. Sometimes it is wiser to let them rest." Miss Marple's final reflection. On her last evening in St. Anselm, Miss Marple sat in the garden where it had all begun, her knitting providing its customary meditative rhythm. The marquee was long gone, the bunting taken down, but the ghost of that fatal afternoon lingered in the long shadows cast by ancient oaks. Inspector Craddock had expressed his lingering puzzlement during their final conversation. "I still don't quite see what made you look beyond, Mrs. Gable. The evidence could so easily have settled there." Miss Marple's smile had been gentle but knowing. "My dear Inspector, Mrs. Gable is a woman who has cherished her grievances like hot water bottles for years. Quite comforting in their way, But true murder requires a different quality entirely. Resentment broods, desperation moves. Mr. Marsden had the particular grim energy of one who sees the abyss opening under his feet and believes he can push someone else into it instead. The church bells began to toll the evening hour, their sound drifting across the valley, mournful yet enduring, marking the passage of time that heals all wounds eventually. As Miss Marple packed away her knitting, she reflected on the curious mathematics of the case. 3 cups prepared with such care, each representing a different aspect of human nature. One had been intended for friendship, one for honor, and one, through terrible mischance, for death. The greatest tragedy, she murmured to herself as the train carried her back to St. Mary Mead, was that Mr. Whitfield died trying to protect the very inheritance his murderer sought to claim. He came as a guardian and died as an obstacle, victim of another's impatience and greed. The countryside rolled past her window, hedgerows and church spires, and fields where nothing more violent than the turning of seasons seemed to occur. Yet Miss Marple knew better. Murder might visit quiet villages only occasionally, but the small passions that led to it, envy, fear, greed, and foolish love, were present everywhere, as constant and familiar as the pattern of her own needles clicking in the gathering dusk. St. Anselm would remember this summer for years to come, but it would also forget, as villages must, filing away the darkness so that life could continue in all its messy, hopeful complexity. And perhaps that, Miss Marple reflected, was the greatest mystery of all, not how people could commit murder, but how they could survive it and still find reasons to pour tea for their neighbors on quiet Sunday afternoons. The healing and the wisdom. The following Sunday brought St. Anselm's first proper gathering since the murder, a carefully orchestrated tea at the vicarage garden that served as both social event and collective healing ritual. Mrs. Hayworth, determined to restore moral order through the application of sponge cake and weak china tea, had invited a select group to demonstrate that normal life could indeed resume. The tea service was pointedly humble. Thick, mismatched cups that no one would covet and certainly no one would poison. Miss Marple, positioned strategically near the garden's edge with her knitting, observed how the company arranged itself with unconscious village logic. Those touched by scandal maintained careful distances, while those whose consciences were clear, or whose sins were safely historical, clustered closer to the refreshments. Clara Fairfax arrived fashionably late, wearing a simple blue frock that suggested a young woman who had chosen to live, rather than mourn indefinitely. The transformation was remarkable. The timid creature who had wept at the garden party had been replaced by someone with quiet self-possession. Mrs. Gable appeared more subdued than anyone could remember, keeping to conversation's periphery until Mrs. Bantry approached with 2 sturdy teacups. The brief hesitation on both sides was quickly smoothed over with English determination not to acknowledge unpleasantness unnecessarily. "I suppose we are to become a cautionary tale, Elspeth," Mrs. Bantry remarked, offering the safer-looking cup, "about not letting grievances simmer. They invite trouble to dinner, uninvited." Mrs. Gable accepted the cup with a ghost of her former sharpness. Better that than sermons about trusting musicians. Half the parish has abandoned gramophone records entirely. Their shared flicker of humor, faint but genuine, marked the beginning of reconciliation in the understated way English villages managed such things. New revelations through correspondence. The weeks following brought letters to Miss Marple that filled in disturbing details about Geoffrey's methodology. Young Elsie, writing anonymously from the reformatory, revealed the true extent of his manipulation. During courtship visits to Rosemount House, he had systematically catalogued household routines, even photographing documents and measuring the Spode cup's dimensions to ensure poison distribution. His preparation had been obsessively thorough, suggesting a mind far more dangerous than his charming facade indicated. Most chilling was Elsie's revelation that Geoffrey had prepared contingency plans for multiple victims. The cherry laurel preparation contained enough poison for 3 doses. If Mrs. Bantry's death hadn't achieved his objectives, others would have followed. He told me it was like composing music, Elsie had written. Each note perfectly placed, each timing precisely calculated. He said the beauty lay in orchestration, making everything seem natural and inevitable. Additional correspondence from Carey brought news that cast Whitfield's death in an even more tragic light. His estate papers contained a detailed memorandum proving his intentions had been honorable. He was traveling to St. Anselm to recommend the codicil's rejection based on evidence of Geoffrey's tampering he had discovered weeks earlier. The man who had traded in others' secrets throughout his career had died attempting genuine protection, his murder both ironic and tragically unnecessary. Individual transformations. Clara's evolution proved the most hopeful outcome. Using her inheritance, she had established a small music school in St. Anselm, reclaiming from Geoffrey's betrayal something genuinely beneficial. The irony was profound. The shy girl who could barely speak at the garden party now commanded classrooms full of energetic children with quiet authority. She was learning, as she wrote to Miss Marple from a brief sojourn in Florence, to distinguish between copies and originals in both art and people. Mrs. Gable's transformation was more subtle but equally significant. Whitfield's estate had yielded a modest bequest to those wronged by my family's past actions, which included both her and Carey. More importantly, the exposure of her ancient grievances had stripped away much self-righteousness, leaving someone more vulnerable than venomous. Philosophical reflections. It was during her nephew Raymond West's autumn visit to St. Mary Mead that Miss Marple articulated her deepest thoughts about the case. They sat in her drawing room among the asters purple and gold, her own plain china tea service, notably free of scandalous history. Between them, "You see it as tragedy of grand passions," Miss Marple observed, "whereas I see it as simple accounting. Mr. Marsden wasn't a Gothic villain, but merely someone who lived beyond his means and viewed people as assets or liabilities. When his debts exceeded his patience, he attempted to balance the ledger through murder." Raymond raised an eyebrow. "And the irony of the lucky cups? Considering one held death, that seems grimly humorous." "On the contrary," Miss Marple corrected gently. "Carey said those cups brought good fortune to those who drank from them. In a terrible, roundabout way, perhaps they did." "How can you possibly say that?" "A man died. Mr. Whitfield lived by uncovering secrets and died revealing ultimate truth. Had he not died, Clara would have married a murderer, been isolated, her fortune drained and eventually eliminated when she became a liability." Miss Marple's needles clicked with sudden sharpness. The cup revealed the poison before marriage vows were spoken. A terrible price, but it bought a young woman her life. She looked toward the window where autumn leaves drifted onto the lawn. The third cup, the one remaining untouched, represented Clara's future. It remained pure. The poison meant to secure it for Mr. Marsden instead ensured he never tasted it. The symbolic resolution. Back at Rosemount House, Carey had made her decision about the remaining Spode cups. Rather than destroying them, her great-aunt would never forgive such waste. She placed them on the highest shelf of her cabinet. "Not smashed," she explained to Miss Marple, "but not on the tea tray either. Sometimes objects serve best as reminders to look twice at everything." The cups would remain there, beautiful and untouchable, carrying their complex history of family grievance, romantic deception, and tragic revelation. They had indeed proved lucky, though not in any way their original owner could have anticipated. Final wisdom. As Miss Marple prepared to leave St. Anselm, she reflected on the curious mathematics of justice. Geoffrey Marsden had believed himself the author of that afternoon's events, writing a script where everyone played assigned parts. He had forgotten that in real life, people improvise. Mrs. Gable's guilt, Whitfield's thirst, Miss Marple's own presence. He couldn't control them all. The truly dangerous criminals, she had observed to Inspector Craddock, are those who view their crimes as artistic endeavors rather than moral failures. They become so enamored with their own cleverness that they lose sight of human cost entirely. St. Anselm would remember this summer for years, but it would also forget, as villages must, filing away darkness so life could continue in all its messy, hopeful complexity. The church bells still tolled the hours, children still played on village greens, and neighbors still invited each other for tea, though perhaps they looked a little more closely at the cups they were offered. 3 cups, Miss Marple murmured as her train carried her back to St. Mary Mead, and only one with death in it. The odds really are rather in our favor. The mystery was solved, the ledger balanced, and the cups were finally, truly put away. Life would reassert itself in all its reassuring triviality, while Miss Marple returned to her garden and her knitting, ready for whatever small human dramas might next require her gentle but inexorable attention to truth. The letter arrived at Miss Marple's cottage in St. Mary Mead on a crisp November afternoon, bearing news that would cast the entire St. Anselm tragedy in its final, most poignant light. Clara Fairfax herself followed within the week, arriving with the confident bearing of a young woman who had learned to distinguish between genuine affection and skilled performance. The final revelation. "I've come to thank you properly," Clara said as they settled into Miss Marple's cozy sitting room, where autumn light filtered through lace curtains onto her simple tea service. "And to tell you something I've only just discovered. Something that changes how I understand everything that happened." Miss Marple poured tea with deliberate care, noting how Clara accepted her cup without hesitation or fear. The young woman had clearly made peace with the symbolism of shared refreshment, transforming what had once been an instrument of terror into a gesture of friendship. Clara's revelation proved as significant as Miss Marple had suspected it might be. "My father's solicitors found additional papers last week. Letters between my father and Mr. Whitfield from years ago, when Geoffrey first appeared in my life. My father had hired Whitfield to investigate Geoffrey's background. He suspected something was fundamentally wrong, but died before receiving the final report. The implications transformed Roger Whitfield from opportunistic blackmailer into something far more noble, a man honoring a commission from beyond the grave, completing a father's final attempt to protect his daughter. The investigation had revealed Geoffrey's complete fabrication, stolen compositions, forged credentials, an entirely false identity built on other men's achievements. When my father died suddenly, Whitfield continued the investigation on his own," Clara continued, her voice steady with newfound strength. "Geoffrey must have discovered this somehow, perhaps intercepted correspondence or bribed someone in Whitfield's office. He realized his entire scheme was unraveling and decided murder was his only option." The psychology of method. Miss Marple set down her teacup with characteristic precision. "The terrible irony is that Mr. Whitfield was coming to the garden party, not as adversary, but as guardian. Yet Mr. Marsden's vanity led him to construct an unnecessarily elaborate scheme that ultimately exposed him." Clara looked puzzled. "How do you mean?" "Your Geoffrey was a man of immense pride who didn't simply want to commit murder. He wanted to stage a tragedy with himself as the unseen director, but his need for dramatic effect required credible witnesses." Miss Marple's pale blue eyes grew thoughtful. "If he had poisoned me, he would have had only Mrs. Pemberton, who was hysterical, and Mrs. Bantry, who was flighty, as observers. He needed someone with a reputation for accuracy to validate his fiction of accidental death." The full cleverness of Miss Marple's deduction became clear. "He needed me alive, my dear, to serve as his unwitting accomplice in creating a believable accident. Therefore, the cup placed in the position of honor, mine, was the safest vessel on that table. I drank from it not from recklessness, but from logical certainty. The village's healing news from St. Anselm painted a picture of gradual recovery and unexpected growth. Clara had established a modest music school, transforming her inheritance into something genuinely beneficial while reclaiming from Geoffrey's betrayal a love of music untainted by deception. Mrs. Gable sends me her most obstinate Sunday school children for discipline disguised as culture, Clara reported with amusement. She says you predicted I should find a use for my stubbornness. The other characters had found their own paths toward healing. Mrs. Gable and Mrs. Bantry had achieved a cordial détente that occasionally approached genuine friendship, their ancient grievances finally laid to rest. Young Elsie, released early from the reformatory for exemplary behavior, had found employment with a sympathetic family and was training as a nurse's aide, her natural gentleness with patients serving as both penance and redemption. Most significantly, Carrie Pemberton had made her decision about the 3 Spode cups. Rather than destroying them or keeping them as painful reminders, she had donated them to the British Museum's ceramics collection, where they would be preserved as examples of early 19th century craftsmanship rather than instruments of murder. "Let them be beautiful again," Carrie had written, "without the weight of our terrible history." The deeper pattern. This final revelation illuminated what Miss Marple had sensed throughout the investigation, a pattern of protective love twisted into tragedy by one man's malevolent calculation. Mr. Fairfax had loved his daughter enough to investigate her suitor despite his own failing health. Whitfield had honored that commission beyond death and payment, transforming from predator to protector in his final act. Even Mrs. Gable's resentments, however misplaced, had stemmed from a distorted sense of family loyalty. "You see," Miss Marple observed gently, "Mr. Marsden believed himself the only intelligent actor in a drama of fools. He underestimated everyone, your father's foresight, Mr. Whitfield's integrity, even Mrs. Gable's capacity for honesty when confronted. Most fatally, he underestimated you." Clara looked surprised. "Me? I was the perfect victim, timid, isolated, easily controlled." "On the surface, perhaps. But you possessed something Mr. Marsden lacked entirely, the capacity for genuine feeling. When you spoke at the garden party about the codicil, demanding truth rather than accepting convenient lies, you demonstrated courage he couldn't comprehend. That moment sealed his fate more surely than any evidence. The question of love. As Clara prepared to depart for Italy, Florence to study art history in what she described as running towards something genuine for the first time, she posed the question that had haunted her since Geoffrey's arrest. "Do you think he ever loved me at all, Miss Marple? Even a little?" Miss Marple considered carefully before responding. "I think Mr. Marsden loved the idea of you, the fortune, the security, the social position. Whether he was capable of loving the actual person you are, I cannot say. Some people view others as mirrors, reflecting their own desires, rather than as separate souls deserving respect." She paused, her pale blue eyes kind but unflinching. "The more important question, my dear, is whether you have learned to love yourself enough to recognize the difference between genuine affection and skilled performance. That distinction, once mastered, provides better protection than any amount of suspicion or cynicism." Final reflections. After Clara departed, Miss Marple sat quietly with her knitting as twilight gathered outside her windows. The case of the 3 cups had concluded as satisfactorily as murder cases ever could. Justice served, innocence protected, and lessons learned by those capable of learning them. Yet she found herself thinking not of Geoffrey Marsden's punishment or Clara's liberation, but of Roger Whitfield, the man whose death had seemed so random yet proved so purposeful. He had lived by exploiting secrets and died protecting one, transforming in his final act from predator to guardian. Perhaps redemption came in unexpected forms. He couldn't undo the harm he had caused throughout his career, but he could prevent one final tragedy, even at the cost of his own life. The three cups had taught their final lesson, that objects, like people, carried histories both visible and hidden, and that wisdom lay in looking carefully before drinking deeply from anything life offered. They had indeed proved lucky, though not in any way their original owner could have anticipated, serving as crucible for truth, revealing a murderer before he could claim his intended victim, and ultimately finding peace in a museum where they could be beautiful without bearing the weight of terrible history. Miss Marple resumed her knitting with quiet satisfaction, ready for whatever small mysteries the coming winter might bring. The accounts were finally balanced, the village could heal, and human nature would continue its eternal dance between darkness and light, always providing work for those who cared to understand its intricate patterns. The case was closed, but the lessons remained, that protective love, however imperfect, ultimately proved stronger than malevolent calculation, and that truth, though expensive, always cost less than the alternative of living with carefully constructed lies.